This is the recording they tried to bury. For months, the whispers have circulated through the hallways of NATO headquarters, through the back rooms of the G7, through encrypted diplomatic cables that were never supposed to see daylight. But as of 9:47 a.m. this morning, Thursday, February 27, 2026, the whispers just became a roar. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, standing behind the oak podium in the House of Commons in Ottawa, did something no Allied leader has ever done to a sitting American president. He played the tapes, not summaries, not transcripts, not second-hand accounts filtered through anonymous sources, actual audio recordings of private phone conversations between himself and Donald Trump, conversations in which the President of the United States allegedly threatened to collapse the Canadian economy, threatened to freeze Arctic shipping lanes, and threatened to personally ensure that Carney would be, in Trump's words, finished on the world stage. For the first time in the history of the Western alliance, a head of state has publicly exposed the private threats of an American president. The diplomatic world is in free fall. The timing is surgical. This is happening exactly 1 week after the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that Trump's sweeping IEEPA tariffs were unconstitutional, a decision that humiliated the administration and sent the White House scrambling to reimpose duties under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. It is happening as markets digest the aftershock of $175 billion in potential tariff refunds owed to American businesses. It is happening as Trump's approval among independents has cratered to 38%, according to leaked RNC polling. It is happening as the 2026 midterms loom like a guillotine over the Republican House majority. And it is happening exactly 5 weeks after Trump publicly told the world at Davos that Canada should be grateful for American patronage. We are talking about a constitutional confrontation between two sovereign nations. We are talking about potential violations of the Presidential Records Act and the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. We are talking about the possible unraveling of the Kuzma trade agreement, the fracturing of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing alliance, and the strategic realignment of Canada toward Europe and China. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly what is on those recordings. We are going to explain the legal mechanisms at play. We are going to reveal what sources inside the West Wing are saying, and we are going to answer the question every analyst in Washington is asking. Is this the moment the alliance system finally breaks? Buckle up. History just pressed record. To understand why Carney pulled the trigger today, we have to go back to Davos, January 20th, 2026, the World Economic Forum. Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, a man whose entire career has been built on institutional credibility and measured language, walked onto that stage in Switzerland and dropped a bomb. He declared that the rules-based international order had experienced a rupture, not a transition. He called on middle powers to band together. He said the famous line that echoed through every chancellery in Europe: "If you are not at the table, you are on the menu." The speech received a standing ovation. It was broadcast live on the BBC, on France 24, on NHK, and it reportedly sent Donald Trump into a fury that has not subsided since. Sources inside the White House say Trump watched the speech from the residence on a 30-second delay. According to two senior officials who spoke on condition of anonymity, the president turned to an aide and said, "Who does this banker think he is?" The next day, Trump took the Davos stage and fired back publicly. Canada lives because of the United States. He told the assembled billionaires they should be grateful. He rescinded Canada's invitation to his Board of Peace. He threatened 100% tariffs if Canada pursued trade deals with China. He posted an image on Truth Social depicting Canada as part of the United States. The public posturing was ugly, but the private calls were worse. According to Canadian government sources who briefed reporters this morning, in the 72 hours between the two Davos speeches, Trump called Carney privately 3 times. These are the calls that were recorded, and the content is devastating. Now let us get technical about what is allegedly on those tapes, because the details matter enormously for the legal and diplomatic fallout. According to the transcript excerpts released by the Prime Minister's office, in Ottawa at 9:50 a.m. today, the first call occurred on January 20th at approximately 11:15 p.m. Central European Time, roughly 5 hours after Carney's speech. Sources say the conversation lasted 14 minutes. In it, Trump allegedly told Carney that if Canada continued to play games with China, the United States would invoke Section 232 national security tariffs on Canadian oil, natural gas, and electricity exports. Here is why that threat is so devastating. Canada exports approximately $120 billion worth of energy to the United States annually. That is roughly 22% of all U.S. energy imports. A Section 232 action on Canadian energy would be the economic equivalent of a naval blockade. It would spike American heating costs by an estimated $200 per household in northern states like Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, states that Trump won by razor-thin margins in 2024. It would crash the Canadian dollar. It would trigger force majeure clauses in thousands of cross-border supply contracts worth an estimated $340 billion. The auto plants in Ontario that supply parts to factories in Ohio and Kentucky would shut down within 72 hours. The natural gas pipelines feeding New England heating systems would face diversion orders. Trump reportedly said this would happen within 48 hours if Carney did not publicly retract his Davos remarks. The second call occurred on January 21st at approximately 8:30 a.m. Just hours before Trump's own Davos address. This is the call that has intelligence agencies across the Five Eyes scrambling. Sources say Trump raised the issue of Arctic sovereignty. He reportedly told Carney that the United States would begin freedom of navigation exercises through the Northwest Passage, a waterway that Canada claims as internal waters, but which the United States has long considered an international strait. What makes Trump's alleged threat extraordinary is the specificity. Sources who have reviewed the transcript say Trump told Carney he would authorize U.S. Navy vessels, not just Coast Guard cutters, to transit the passage with or without Canadian permission, and that if Canadian forces attempted to interfere, your little boats will have a very bad day. That language, if confirmed, constitutes an implied threat of military force by one NATO ally against another. There is no precedent for this in the 77-year history of the alliance. But here is the catch. The third call is the one that has Washington in a state of absolute panic this morning. It occurred on January 21st at 6:45 p.m. CCT, after Trump's own Davos speech, the one where he publicly humiliated Canada. According to Canadian officials, the tone shifted from threatening to transactional. Trump allegedly offered Carney a deal. The United States would drop all tariff threats, restore the border of peace invitation, and publicly praise Carney as a great leader if Carney agreed to 3 conditions. 1. Publicly endorse the Greenland Acquisition Framework. 2. Withdraw Canadian opposition to U.S. Arctic claims. 3. Cancel Canada's recently announced trade partnership with China, the deal that included allowing up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market. Sources in the PMO say Carney declined all 3, and it was at that point that Trump allegedly said the sentence now plastered across every front page in the Western world. "Mark, you are making a very big mistake. I will make sure you are finished. Not just in politics, finished everywhere. I have people who can make that happen." The legal implications of these recordings cascade across at least 5 jurisdictions. In Canada, the CSIS Act authorizes the collection of intelligence related to threats to national security. Carney's office is arguing that Trump's threats constituted a direct security threat to Canadian sovereignty, thereby justifying the recordings without consent. In the United States, no federal law prohibits a foreign head of state from recording a conversation with the president. The question is whether the release constitutes espionage, diplomacy, or an act of provocation. The White House counsel's office has been in emergency session since 6 a.m. Eastern. They are reportedly preparing a filing with the International Court of Justice, arguing Canada violated Article 41 of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, but there is no precedent for this filing. They are building the legal theory from scratch. Here is what nobody is talking about this morning. The existence of these recordings means that every conversation Donald Trump has had with any foreign leader since January 20th, 2025, is now potentially compromised. Every call with Zelensky about Ukraine, every call with Netanyahu about Gaza, every call with Mohammed bin Salman about oil prices, Every call with Xi Jinping about Taiwan, every leader on earth is now asking, did they record me too? And more critically, did I say something I cannot afford to have made public? Sources inside the State Department described the atmosphere as total institutional paralysis. Ambassadors from at least 14 countries have requested emergency consultations with their counterparts in Ottawa, not to condemn Carney, to find out what else Canada knows. This is the contagion effect. The recordings themselves are damaging, but the uncertainty they create is catastrophic. The entire architecture of great power diplomacy, the phone calls, the back channels, the off-the-record assurances is built on the assumption of confidentiality. Carney just detonated that assumption. He did not just release tapes. He destroyed the trust infrastructure of international relations. And trust once broken at this level does not rebuild in months or years. It takes generations. It gets worse. The timing of the release is synchronized with a coordinated diplomatic offensive that suggests months of preparation. Within 2 hours of Carney's parliamentary statement, the following events occurred in rapid succession. At 11:50 a.m. Eastern, French President Emmanuel Macron issued a statement calling for an emergency session of the NATO North Atlantic Council. At 12:15 p.m., German Chancellor Friedrich Merz called for a formal EU investigation into whether Trump's threats constitute grounds for invoking Article 4 of the North Atlantic Treaty. At 12:30 p.m., the Danish Prime Minister released a statement linking the recordings to Trump's ongoing Greenland pressure campaign. At 12:45 p.m., Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese called for a Five Eyes emergency review. This is not spontaneous. This is a coordinated strike. Carney is the tip of a spear that has been sharpened behind closed doors by a coalition of middle powers who have collectively decided that the risk of confronting America is now less than the risk of remaining silent. Sources inside the West Wing describe the president's reaction as beyond nuclear. Trump reportedly learned of the recordings from Fox News, not from his own intelligence briefing, because the CIA had been caught off guard as well. His first reaction was to demand the immediate expulsion of the Canadian ambassador. His second was to call for closure of the US-Canada border, the longest undefended border in the world, at 525 miles. His third was to order the Pentagon to prepare a demonstration of force near the Canadian border, a request that Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth reportedly told him was not advisable. The White House put out a statement at 10:30 a.m. calling the recordings illegally obtained fabrications designed to destabilize the democratically elected government of the United States. But the statement did not deny the content. That is the detail every analyst is focused on. They called the recordings fabrications. They did not say the words attributed to Trump are false. In legal terms, a non-denial denial. In political terms, an admission wrapped in outrage. The financial hemorrhage is already cascading through global markets as we speak. The Dow Jones dropped 847 points in the first 90 minutes of trading. The S&P 500 is down 3.2%. The Canadian dollar, paradoxically, is up 1.8% against the greenback because investors are interpreting Carney's move as a sign of strength. Gold has surged past $3,400 an ounce. Treasury yields on the 10-year note have spiked to 4.9% as Canadian pension funds holding an estimated $280 billion in US Treasuries begin what traders are calling the credibility unwind. The fear is not the recordings themselves. The fear is that if Canada, America's closest ally, no longer trusts the United States enough to keep conversations private, then who does? The Japanese, holding $1.1 trillion in US debt, are watching. The Europeans, with $4.3 trillion in cross-Atlantic exposure, are watching. The recordings are not just an embarrassment. They are a repricing event for American credibility. And American credibility, more than aircraft carriers, more than nuclear warheads, is the single most valuable asset the United States possesses. Let us push the scenario to the extreme. If the NATO North Atlantic Council convenes under Article 4, it will be the first time in history that consultations have been triggered by the actions of the alliance's own leading member. The precedent most cited is Turkey's invocation in 2003 before the Iraq War, but those were external threats. This would be an internal reckoning. If the investigation finds that Trump's threats constitute a genuine security risk, NATO faces an existential choice. It can censure the United States, symbolically devastating but legally toothless. It can improvise a suspension of US voting rights through a consensus resolution, or it can do what some European defense hawks have been quietly advocating: begin the formal construction of a European Canadian Pacific defense architecture that operates in parallel to NATO without depending on American leadership. Sources inside the Elysee Palace say Macron has already commissioned a feasibility study concluding that a coalition of France, the UK, Germany, Canada, Japan, Australia, and South Korea could field combined defense capability equal to 60% of US force projection within 36 months. The estimated cost is $780 billion over 3 years, funded through a combination of defense bonds and redirected NATO contributions. That is not a replacement for America. It is an insurance policy. And the fact that it exists, that allied nations have been quietly planning for a post-American security architecture while smiling at NATO summits, tells you everything about how far the trust has eroded, long before Khan pressed play. The domestic political fallout is equally devastating. Remember, this is a president who just 2 weeks ago threatened to block the opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge between Detroit and Windsor, a $4 billion infrastructure project that Canada paid for entirely because he wanted leverage in trade negotiations. Layer that on top of the Supreme Court tariff ruling from February 20th, when 6 justices, including 2 Trump appointees, told the president his signature economic policy was illegal. Trump called them unpatriotic and an embarrassment to their families. He immediately reimposed tariffs under a different statute, daring the courts to stop him. Now add Carney's tapes. The picture that emerges is of a president who threatens allies in private, defies the judiciary in public, blocks bridges for leverage, and burns institutional relationships to preserve personal power. For Republicans heading into November, this is a 5-alarm fire. Sources inside the RNC say internal models now project losses of 25 to 35 House seats and a possible 3-seat Senate flip if the recordings dominate the cycle through March. The invisible primary for 2028 has accelerated by 2 years. Vance, Dantis, Haley, and Yunnan are all making calls, today, not to defend the president, to position for the aftermath. The donors, the Wall Street money, the corporate PACs are watching this and calculating the cost of loyalty. And in American politics, when the money starts doing math instead of making bets, the regime is already over. The psychological dimension cannot be overstated. Trump built his identity on being the ultimate deal maker. The recordings shatter that myth. They show a leader who resorts to threats when charm fails, who confuses intimidation with negotiation. For the MAGA base, the reaction will be rage. They will call it a setup. They will call it election interference. But among independents, among suburban voters, among retired military officers who understand alliances, the recordings confirm their worst fear. The bluster is not an act. The man who said, "Your little boats will have a very bad day," to a NATO ally meant it. That realization, once it settles, does not go away. It metastasizes through every conversation at every kitchen table in every swing district in America. What does Putin see when he looks at this? He sees the fracture he has worked toward since 2014. The entire Russian strategic doctrine has been to weaken NATO from within. The Khan recordings accomplish more for that objective than a decade of Russian information operations. What does Xi Jinping see? An opening. Canada just signed a trade partnership with China. If the recordings prove Trump bullied Carney over that deal, Beijing reframes itself as a refuge for nations, threatened by Washington. The dollarization agenda accelerates, the narrative flips, and Xi, who has spent years cultivating the global south, will exploit this moment to its fullest. History teaches us that cornered leaders are dangerous. Nixon in 1974 was so erratic that Secretary of Defense Schlesinger quietly instructed the military to verify any presidential orders with him. We are not there yet, but we are closer than any point since Watergate. Trump is facing a Supreme Court that humiliated him on tariffs, allied leader who exposed his private threats to the world, midterms that could strip him of congressional support, potential NATO sanctions, the largest credibility crisis in American diplomacy since the Bay of Pigs. And he is facing all of this simultaneously with a cabinet purged of dissent and military leadership increasingly uncomfortable with the gap between lawful orders and political demands. This is exactly what the founders feared. This is why the Emoluments Clause exists. This is why the 25th Amendment exists. The question is whether those mechanisms still function. We are in uncharted waters. The maps are useless. No Allied leader has ever released recordings of an American president. No president has been simultaneously rebuked by his Supreme Court, exposed by a foreign ally, and facing a NATO investigation in the same week. The precedents do not exist because the situation was supposed to be impossible. It was supposed to be impossible because the system was designed to prevent it. The system assumed the president would operate within norms. That assumption is dead. As we head into tonight, watch for three things. Watch for the NATO Council announcement, which sources say will come before midnight Brussels time. Watch for the SUSMA response, because the trade deal review is now a flashpoint for retaliation. And watch Truth Social, because the President of the United States, watching his own words played back to him on a parliamentary floor broadcast to 8 billion people, is about to respond. It will not be a tweet. It will be an executive order, a tariff escalation, a military posture shift, or a demand for Carney's removal. All of those options make the crisis worse. None of them make it go away. For one man in the White House tonight, this is not a political crisis. It is an identity crisis. Trump has spent his entire life controlling the narrative, controlling what people see, what people hear, what people believe. But you cannot negotiate with your own voice on tape. You cannot spin what the world has already heard. The recordings are not an allegation. They are a mirror. And for a man who has spent 79 years constructing an image of invincible strength, being forced to confront that mirror is a fate worse than any legal consequence, any electoral defeat, any financial loss. The voice on those tapes does not sound like the leader of the free world. It sounds like a man who is afraid. And fear, once the audience detects it, is the one thing that cannot be taken back. The alliance is fracturing, the markets are bleeding, the tapes are playing, and the world is listening. Subscribe. Stay tuned because the next 48 hours will determine whether the Western alliance survives its own leader or whether the order that kept the peace for 8 decades finally collapses under the weight of one man's hubris. The history books are not just being written this week. They are being recorded, and this time everybody can